Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. The air at Boreas Station doesn't just feel cold. It feels sharp, like 1,000 tiny crystalline needles pressing simultaneously against any exposed millimeter of skin, searching for a way to burrow into the bone. It is a predatory kind of cold, a living entity that waits patiently just beyond the reinforced triple-pane glass of the observation decks, hungry for the warmth of human blood. My name is Elias Thorne. Before the world stopped making sense, before the fragile illusion of civilization shattered into microscopic pieces on the morning of October 15th, 2024, I was a lead security specialist for Outbreak Dynamics. I was a man who traded the searing, suffocating heat of the Middle East for the absolute, terrifying zero of the Canadian Arctic. I spent 12 agonizing, blood-soaked years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, doing things in the unforgiving deserts of Mosul and Kandahar that I'd rather forget. Things that still wake me up in the middle of the night, with the phantom smell of cordite and burning hair filling my nostrils. I traded my soul for a uniform, and when the military was done wringing me out, the private sector offered me an absurdly lucrative paycheck to stand in the quietest, most desolate place on Earth and guard a frozen tomb. Boreas Station was a marvel of modern engineering and corporate hubris, a Tier 4 research facility buried deep in the permafrost, completely isolated from the chaotic noise of the modern world. We were a ghost station, a collection of sterile white corridors and humming server rooms situated 300 miles from anything that could be considered civilization. Our official mandate was to study permafrost pathogens, ancient, dormant bacteria, and prehistoric viruses that had been trapped in the ice for millennia, waiting for the world to warm up just enough to let them out. The executives at Outbreak Dynamics assured us that we were perfectly safe. We had enough reinforced, high-density concrete surrounding us to survive a direct nuclear blast, and our subterranean storage vaults were packed with enough MREs, dehydrated rations, medical supplies, and filtered water to last a garrison of 50 people for 2 solid years. I thought the ice was my shield. I looked out at the endless, blinding expanse of the tundra every single day and believed that the 300 miles of frozen, unforgiving nothingness was the ultimate moat. I believed that nothing could cross that white desert and survive. I was wrong. God, I was so incredibly wrong. It all started at precisely 9:12 a.m. The exact time is burned into my retinas, etched into the grooves of my brain like acid. I was sitting in the central security hub, a claustrophobic room bathed in the sterile blue light of a dozen high-definition monitors. I was drinking a cup of synthetic coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and battery acid, trying to force the caffeine into my bloodstream while mindlessly checking the thermal perimeter feeds. The tundra outside was a flat, unbroken sheet of blinding white, the morning sun barely a pale, anemic ghost hovering weakly on the horizon, offering light but absolutely no warmth. The station was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic, soothing hum of the massive HVAC systems and the occasional muted footsteps of researchers walking down the distant corridors. Then, without any warning, the Global Network Health Monitor, a massive screen dedicated to tracking the stability of the global internet backbone, turned a violent, bleeding red. It wasn't a localized outage. It wasn't a routing error. The entire map of the world, usually glowing with a web of pulsing green data lines, was rapidly darkening, consumed by a spreading crimson stain. Our systems administrator, a brilliant, perpetually caffeinated 20-something named Marcus, who could hack a heavily encrypted government mainframe or a smart toaster if you gave him enough time, and Red Bull called me over. His voice didn't have its usual sarcastic, easygoing lilt. He wasn't joking about my age or my archaic taste in music. He was staring at a live satellite feed of Vancouver, his face illuminated by the harsh light of the monitor, his skin the color of old parchment. Even from that extreme orbital altitude, looking down through the thin layer of clouds, you could see the smoke. It wasn't just a fire, it was a conflagration. Massive, thick, black pillars of smoke were rising from the city center, twisting and curling into the stratosphere like giant, accusing fingers reaching for a god that had clearly already abandoned the earth. Silas, Elias, the internet is dying, Marcus whispered, his voice so thin and fragile it sounded like a guitar string about to snap under immense tension. It's not a server crash. It's not a cyber attack. It's a complete, systematic blackout. I'm picking up frantic military broadcasts on the encrypted UHF bands. They're initiating Protocol Black Alpha. Do you know what that means? They're abandoning the urban centers. They're pulling out the military and leaving the civilians behind. They're calling it a mass casualty biological event. It's everywhere, Elias. It's everywhere all at once. I pushed my chair back, the wheels scraping harshly against the linoleum floor, and stood over Marcus's shoulder. My eyes locked on the screen. He rapidly switched the feed to a cluster of live traffic cameras in Seattle, pulling up a grid of high-definition nightmare fuel. The footage was in crisp 4K, silent and terrifyingly clear. The streets, usually choked with morning commuters, were a war zone of abandoned cars, shattered glass, and absolute chaos. My eyes tracked a specific camera feed, showing a downtown intersection. A woman in a bright, cheerful yellow summer dress was sprinting down the sidewalk, her bare feet bleeding, her face a mask of primal, unadulterated terror. She was running toward a heavily armored police officer who had taken a defensive stance behind the open door of his cruiser. But the woman wasn't running for help. As she closed the distance, her movements changed. They became erratic, twitchy, impossibly fast. The officer raised his sidearm and fired. I could see the muzzle flashes 3 distinct bursts of light, 3 rounds, center mass, hollow point bullets that should have dropped a man twice her size. She didn't even flinch. There was no stumble, no hesitation, no shock. The kinetic energy of the bullets simply passed through her without slowing her momentum. She hit the officer with the devastating force of a runaway freight train, tackling him over the door of the cruiser. They crashed onto the asphalt, and within seconds, the camera feed was swarmed. A tide of reaching, desperate, blood-soaked hands poured out from the alleyways and storefronts, burying the officer and the woman in a writhing, chaotic mound of human flesh. By noon, the satellite feeds began to flicker, stuttering as the infrastructure holding the modern world together began to physically melt down. The power grids on the mainland were failing, the servers were overheating, and the cameras went dark one by one, replaced by a cold, uncaring static. The silence that followed the death of the internet was heavier than the Arctic cold outside. It was a suffocating, crushing weight that settled over the security hub. We were 30 souls, scientists, technicians, engineers, and a handful of security personnel, stranded on a frozen rock in the middle of absolute nowhere, and the vibrant, noisy, complicated world we belonged to had just vanished into the dark. I didn't wait for the station director to issue orders. In a vacuum of leadership, hesitation is death. I had learned that in the blood-soaked sand of Fallujah, and it applied just as much to the pristine ice of the Arctic. I sprinted to the armory, my boots echoing like gunshots in the empty corridors. I grabbed my tactical vest, the familiar comforting weight of the Kevlar plates settling over my shoulders. I checked my primary weapon, a heavily modified Daniel Defense V7 AR-15. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of machinery equipped with a Trijicon ACOG optic for medium-range engagements and a surefire suppressor to keep the noise down. My sidearm, resting snugly in its drop-leg holster, was a Sig Sauer P226, completely reliable, utterly unforgiving. In the Arctic, you don't just fight physical enemies, you fight the environment itself. Weapons freeze, lubricants turn to glue, and skin sticks to raw metal. I stripped the weapons down mentally, confirming they were winterized. I checked the primary magazine, 30 rounds of 5.56 NATO, armor piercing. I slapped it into the magwell, the sharp metallic click echoing in the armory. I had 6 more fully loaded magazines strapped to my vest, plus 3 extra magazines for the SIG. I walked over to the central command console and slammed my hand down on the emergency lockdown override. I ordered the massive, foot-thick exterior steel blast doors locked and magnetically sealed. I switched the station's atmospheric air filtration system to a closed-circuit loop, cutting us off from the outside air entirely. We were officially a submarine buried in the ice. The first 2 days were a blur of panic, denial, and frantic, useless attempts to re-establish contact with the mainland. The scientists argued, the technicians cried, and the silence outside remained absolute. But day 3 was when the silence finally broke. I was in the observation deck, staring out at the endless white, when a sudden, sharp ping echoed from the localized radar console. A C-130 Hercules supply plane had suddenly appeared on our screens. It wasn't broadcasting a transponder code, and it wasn't answering any of our frantic radio hails on the emergency frequencies. It was coming in completely blind, flying way too fast and dangerously low. Marcus and I rushed to the reinforced windows, our breath fogging the glass, as the massive 4-engine beast emerged from the low-hanging cloud cover. It was a terrifying sight. The plane was completely out of control, banking hard to the left, its engines screaming in a deafening, unnatural mechanical agony. We watched in horrified fascination as the pilot attempted a desperate suicidal landing on our frozen, uncleared runway. The plane skipped across the jagged ice like a massive, metallic skipping stone. The moment the landing gear made contact with the permafrost, it sheared off completely in a spectacular, blinding spray of orange sparks and shattered ice. The massive fuselage slammed down onto its belly, the agonizing screech of tearing aluminum drowning out the howling wind. The plane slid uncontrollably, a runaway juggernaut of twisted metal, tearing through our exterior chain-link perimeter fence like it was made of wet tissue paper, before finally coming to a violent, shuddering halt just 50 yards from the main airlock. Marcus and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. We sprinted to the ready room and suited up in our extreme weather gear, heavy insulated parkas, thermal underlayers, double-layered gloves, and polarized goggles to protect our corneas from freezing. We moved through the primary airlock, the heavy steel doors cycling with a loud mechanical hiss. The moment the outer door opened, the minus 40-degree air hit me like a physical blow to the chest, instantly stealing the breath from my lungs and freezing the moisture in my nostrils. Our breath misted in thick white plumes as we stepped out onto the ice. The crash site was a smoldering graveyard of twisted aluminum, shattered glass, and spilled aviation fuel. The massive turboprop engines were still ticking, the superheated metal contracting and cooling rapidly in the freezing snow. The smell of ozone, burning wire, and jet fuel was overpowering, masking any other scent. We approached the fuselage cautiously, our boots crunching loudly on the frozen snow. I had my AR-15 raised to the high-ready position, the red chevron of the ACOG optic glowing fiercely in the dim light, my finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. "Don't open the hatch," I warned Marcus, my voice muffled by the thick fabric of my face mask, my eyes scanning the mangled cockpit windows. "We don't know what the hell is inside." But the main cargo hatch didn't need our help. It buckled outward from the inside with a sickening groan of stressed metal. The heavy door was violently shoved aside, falling onto the ice with a heavy thud. The thing that stumbled out of the darkness of the cargo hold wasn't the friendly, wisecracking supply pilot we had known for the past year. It was a grotesque mockery of a human being. It was a man wearing a shredded, blood-soaked flight suit, but his skin had turned the abhorrent, mottled color of spoiled meat left out in the sun. His veins bulged black beneath the surface of his skin, and his eyes were the worst part. They were completely clouded over, a milky, opaque white, like spoiled milk, completely devoid of anything resembling human consciousness or soul. He moved with a jerky, disjointed insectoid gait, his limbs snapping and popping with every step, his jaw hanging impossibly slack, revealing teeth stained black with dried blood. When his milky, dead eyes locked onto our thermal signatures, he didn't call for help. He let out a wet, rattling guttural moan that seemed to originate from the bottom of his rotting lungs. A sound that physically vibrated in the dense, freezing air and sent a primal spike of adrenaline straight into my heart. He wasn't alone. The shadows inside the fuselage shifted, and a dozen more figures poured out of the wreckage, tumbling over each other in their desperate haste to reach us. They were the rest of the crew, and maybe passengers, all infected, all turned into these mindless driven nightmares. They weren't hampered by the extreme cold. They didn't shiver. They didn't wrap their arms around themselves to conserve body heat. They didn't even seem to register the sub-zero temperatures that should have been freezing the fluid in their joints. They just ran. I had seen a lot of horrific things during my deployments in Mosul. I had seen men blown apart by IEDs. I had seen the aftermath of chemical attacks, but I had never, in my darkest nightmares, seen a man run on a completely shattered, compound-fractured ankle, the jagged, white bone protruding through his boot, scraping audibly against the hard ice with every frantic step without showing a single flicker of pain or hesitation. Headshots only. "Drop them!" I screamed, the military training completely overriding my shock. I raised the AR-15, nestled the stock into the pocket of my shoulder, and exhaled. The first round punched through the freezing air and struck the pilot squarely in the center of his forehead. The back of his skull exploded in a dark mist of frozen blood and gray matter, and he dropped to the ice instantly, collapsing like a marionette whose strings had been violently severed. But the others didn't stop. They didn't look down at their fallen comrade. They were closing the distance terrifyingly fast, their boots slipping and sliding, but their momentum carrying them forward. Beside me, Marcus drew his Glock 19 and began to fire rapidly. The sharp, cracking reports of the 9mm pistol echoed off the station's massive concrete walls like rapid thunderclaps, momentarily deafening me. Marcus was panicking, his shots hitting center mass, tearing chunks of flesh from the infected, but failing to stop them. They just absorbed the kinetic impact and kept coming, their hands reaching out, fingers curled into rigid claws. We began a tactical retreat, stepping backward toward the open airlock, our boots fighting for purchase. On the slick ice, the infected were clawing at our heels, their rattling breaths loud enough to hear over the howling wind. Suddenly, one of them, a woman in a shredded mechanic's jumpsuit, lunged forward with terrifying speed and caught the heavy nylon fabric of Marcus's parka. The material tore with a loud, violent sound that was almost indistinguishable from a human scream. Marcus lost his footing and fell backward onto the ice, his gun skittering out of his hand. The infected woman fell on top of him, her jaw snapping wildly, aiming for his exposed neck. I didn't have time to aim. I lunged forward, gripped the barrel of my AR-15, and swung the heavy, reinforced Magpul stock like a baseball bat. I butt-struck the creature directly in the side of its face. I felt the sickening, wet crunch of its jaw completely shattering under the impact, the bone fragments tearing through its cheek. The force of the blow knocked the creature off Marcus. I grabbed him by the heavy collar of his parka, hauled him to his feet with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, and violently shoved him backward into the airlock. I stepped in after him and slammed my hand against the emergency close button. The massive steel doors began to slide shut, the hydraulic motors whining under the strain. We sealed the door just as a dozen frozen, bloody hands slammed violently against the thick steel from the outside. The impact shook the frame. We collapsed onto the metal grating of the airlock floor, our chests heaving, sucking in the recycled air, our hearts hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. Then the scratching began. It was a horrific, relentless sound. The frantic scraping of human fingernails, bone, and frozen flesh tearing against the unyielding steel of the blast door. It was a sound of mindless, insatiable hunger. That sound, that endless, rhythmic scratching, would become the maddening, inescapable soundtrack of our lives for the next 3 months. By day 30, Boreas Station had ceased to be a research facility. It felt exactly like a high-tech concrete tomb. We were completely safe behind 10 feet of reinforced, military-grade concrete and steel. But the physical safety meant nothing against the psychological rot that was rapidly setting in. Cabin fever is a documented phenomenon, but this was something entirely different. This was the slow, agonizing death of hope. Every single time I walked into the security hub and looked at the exterior thermal monitors, I saw them, the frozen dead, as the terrified scientists had started calling them. Because of the extreme, sub-zero temperatures, the infected bodies outside didn't decompose. The bacteria that would normally break down dead tissue couldn't survive the cold. Instead, they were perfectly preserved, flash-frozen monstrosities. They didn't wander off. They just stood there in the middle of raging, blinding blizzards, their bodies covered in thick layers of frost and snow, swaying back and forth in the howling wind like broken, grotesque metronomes, endlessly waiting for a sound, a heat signature, a reason to move. They were a constant, visual reminder of the apocalypse waiting just inches away. Inside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. We instituted draconian rationing protocols. The vast food stores were meant to last 2 years, but human nature under extreme stress is unpredictable. People were hoarding, stealing, panicking. I took control of the storage vaults. The new law was simple and absolute. 1 MRE a day per person. 2 precisely measured liters of water. No exceptions, not even for the station director. The lack of proper nutrition, combined with a lack of natural sunlight, was turning everyone into gaunt, pale ghosts. Tempers flared over nothing. Fights broke out over a misplaced tool or a perceived slight. I spent my long, sleepless nights sitting alone in the cold, metallic silence of the armory, surrounded by the smell of gun oil and brass. I would strip my AR-15 and my Sig Sauer down to their smallest components, meticulously cleaning, oiling, and reassembling them over and over again until my fingers bled, just to give my hands something to do, to keep my mind from slipping into the abyss. And when the guns were clean, I would sit under the harsh fluorescent light and stare at the worn, creased photograph of my daughter, Joy, that I kept securely tucked inside the tactical visor of my helmet. She was 7 years old in the picture, smiling brightly, missing her 2 front teeth, holding a stuffed bear. I would stare at her face for hours, tracing the lines of her smile with my thumb. The agonizing, soul-crushing part was the uncertainty. I didn't know if she had made it to one of the military safe zones. I didn't know if her mother had gotten her out of Seattle in time. And in my darkest, most terrifying moments, when the scratching on the outer doors seemed exceptionally loud, I wondered if she was one of those things, wandering mindlessly in the dark, scratching at someone else's door. That thought was a poison that I had to constantly fight to keep from infecting my heart. The true horror, the event that finally broke the spirit of Boreas Station, didn't come from the freezing wasteland outside. The infection inside our impenetrable fortress started on day 45. It wasn't a breach of our security protocols. It wasn't a failure of the blast doors. It was a simple, terrifyingly human lie. One of the senior researchers, a brilliant microbiologist named Dr. Evelyn Aris, had been out on the ice during the initial crash of the C-130. In the chaos of the retreat, in the frantic scramble to get inside, she had been scratched. It wasn't a bite. It was just a glancing blow, a tear in her biosuit, and a shallow gouge on her forearm from the fingernails of one of the infected crew members. She had hidden it. She had quietly bandaged it, terrified of being quarantined, terrified of what I would do to her if I found out. She thought, with all her medical arrogance, that she could fight it, that her immune system could handle a localized infection. She was a scientist. She believed in biology, not monsters. But the pathogen that ended the world doesn't announce itself with a dramatic roar or an immediate, violent transformation. It is insidious. It starts with a low-grade fever, a subtle flush of the skin. Then comes the confusion, the terrible migraines, the loss of motor control, the aphasia. And then, when the host's mind is completely consumed, when the fever peaks and cooks the brain from the inside out, the change happens. I was doing my routine midnight patrol of the lower levels when I noticed the heavy, reinforced door to the main mess hall was slightly ajar. The corridor was completely silent, but my instincts, honed by years of urban combat, were screaming at me. I drew my SIG P226, the metal cold against my palm, and pushed the door open with the toe of my boot. The smell hit me before the visual did, and it was a scent that instantly transported me back to the worst days of the war. The room smelled overwhelmingly of raw, coppery blood, ruptured intestines, and the foul, unmistakable stench of evacuated bowels. The emergency lighting bathed the mess hall in a dim, blood-red glow. I moved silently, my weapon leading the way, clearing the corners. I found her in the center of the room, near the stainless steel serving counters. Doctor. Aris was hunched over the mangled remains of a junior communications technician named David. She had him pinned to the floor. The scene was a visceral nightmare. She wasn't just killing him. She was consuming him. Her lab coat was completely saturated with dark, arterial blood. She was tearing at his throat with her teeth, ripping away chunks of flesh and muscle with a savage, animalistic intensity. The sound of her wet chewing and the tearing of meat filled the large room. She heard my footsteps and stopped. She slowly turned her head to look at me. Her glasses were askew, smeared with gore. Her face was unrecognizable, twisted into a mask of pure, predatory hunger. Her eyes had already turned that milky, dead white. Blood dripped steadily from her chin, pooling on the linoleum. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left of Evelyn Eris to talk to. There was no reasoning, no pleading, no medical intervention that could save her or the boy beneath her. The world had shrunk down to the front sight post of my pistol. I raised the SIG, aligned the sights perfectly with the bridge of her nose, took a half breath to steady my hand, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a violent crack of thunder that temporarily deafened me. The 9mm hollow point round entered exactly where I aimed, punching through the back of her skull and painting the stainless steel counter behind her with a horrific splatter of dark blood and brain matter. Her body instantly went limp, collapsing heavily onto the ruined corpse of the young technician. I stood there for a long time, the gun still raised, the acrid smoke from the barrel drifting lazily toward the ventilation shafts. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute. It was the loudest, most oppressive silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the sound of our fragile sanctuary dying. After that night, the paranoia set in permanently. We instituted mandatory, full-body strip searches every 12 hours. Nobody trusted anyone. We were down to exactly 15 living people. The acceptable losses that the corporate manuals talked about had officially become the majority. We were a dying breed, locked in a cage of our own making. By day 60, the station itself began to die. The massive diesel generators, located deep in the subterranean engineering levels, were choking and sputtering under the constant, unrelenting load of keeping the massive facility heated and powered. The main power grid began to flicker erratically. The lights would dim to a dull brown. The hum of the heaters would stutter and die for agonizing minutes. And the temperature inside the station would immediately begin to plummet, the frost creeping rapidly up the concrete walls like a living, crystallizing fungus. I knew the math. I knew that when those generators finally ceased, the ambient temperature inside Boreas Station would drop to match the outside within 48 hours. We would all freeze to death in our sleep, perfectly preserved, just like the monsters waiting outside our doors. I began systematically tearing through the station, searching for anything that could save us. During a frantic search of the station director's private, securely locked office, after I had to physically break the biometric lock with a crowbar, I found a hidden wall safe. Inside, beneath stacks of useless corporate directives and classified pathogen data, I found a handwritten, leather-bound logbook. It contained frantic, desperate notes written by the director in the days leading up to the blackout. It detailed something called the Redemption Protocol. According to the coordinates and the hastily scribbled maps, there was a secondary, highly classified fallback facility, a hardened, military-grade bunker located exactly 100 miles south of our current position. The notes indicated that this bunker was fully automated, powered by a localized geothermal tap, and most importantly, it was equipped with a high-powered, long-range encrypted radio array and a functional, heated helicopter landing pad. It was a lifeline. It was a microscopic ray of hope in a universe of dark ice. I called an emergency meeting in the security hub. The 14 remaining survivors looked like walking corpses, hollow-eyed, malnourished, vibrating with constant, low-level terror. We leave at dawn, I told them, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or discussion. I slapped the map down onto the console. There is a secondary bunker 100 miles south. It has geothermal power and comms. It's our only shot. Marcus immediately pushed back, his hands trembling as he pointed at the meteorological monitors. Elias, are you out of your goddamn mind? It's a suicide march. Look at the barometric pressure dropping. A massive whiteout is coming in from the north. The temperature is going to drop to -60. The wind shear alone will strip the flesh off our bones, not to mention the hundreds of infected standing between us and that bunker. We can't go out there. Staying here is just a much slower, much more pathetic way to die, Marcus, I countered, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. The generators are operating at 15% capacity. When they die, this concrete box becomes a freezer. We will sit here in the dark, and we will freeze, and then we will die. I am not dying in the dark. I am taking the snowcat, I am taking all the weapons, and I am making a run for that bunker. Anyone who wants to sit here and wait for the ice to take them is welcome to stay. Nobody chose to stay. Fear of the unknown was slightly outweighed by the absolute certainty of freezing in the dark. We spent the next 12 hours frantically prepping the snowcat. It was a massive, heavy-duty polar transport vehicle running on wide, reinforced continuous tracks designed to distribute its massive weight over deep snow. It looked like a cross between a tank and a school bus. I stripped the station's armory bare. I welded heavy steel grating, salvaged from the engineering catwalks, over the snowcat's thick windows to prevent the infected from smashing through the glass. I loaded the rear cargo bay with every single jerry can of diesel fuel we had left. Strapping them down securely, I packed the remaining crates of 5.56 NATO, the 9mm ammunition, the medical kits, and whatever MREs we had left. It was a tight, claustrophobic fit for 15 people in heavy winter gear, but it was our only lifeboat. The moment the heavy exterior blast doors groaned open, the cold violently invaded the airlock. I drove the snowcat out onto the ice, the heavy diesel engine roaring, the tracks biting aggressively into the deep snow, crushing the frozen bodies of the infected that had been standing directly outside the doors. The trek across the endless tundra was a surreal, terrifying vision of hell frozen over. The landscape was utterly devoid of color, an infinite expanse of blinding white and deep, shadowy grays. We drove for 2 days, the snowcat's engine a constant deafening roar inside the metal cabin. The heater barely kept the interior above freezing, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and raw fear. On the morning of the 3rd day, we encountered the remains of an abandoned military and research convoy. It was a scene of absolute, silent devastation. Dozens of heavily armored Humvees, transport trucks, and civilian SUVs were scattered haphazardly across the ice, half buried in massive snowdrifts. The horrifying part was that some of the vehicles were still running. Their engines were softly humming, their exhaust pipes puffing weak clouds of white smoke into the freezing air, creating a bizarre, industrial graveyard. As we slowly maneuvered the heavy snowcat through the maze of abandoned metal, I looked closely at the vehicles. The scientists and the military escorts were still inside. They were still buckled securely into their seats, but they were all dead and they were all infected. Their gray, mottled faces were pressed tightly against the frosted glass of their windows. Their dead, milky eyes tracked our massive vehicle as we drove past, their mouths opening and closing in silent, frantic moans, their frozen hands weakly pawing at the inside of the glass, desperate to get to the fresh meat rolling past them. It was a gallery of the damned, perfectly preserved in ice, and the sight of it made the survivors in the back of the snowcat weep openly. Around day 85, our luck finally, catastrophically ran out. The snowcat's heavily abused engine, pushed far beyond its operational limits and choked by the extreme cold, violently seized. There was a loud metallic bang from the engine compartment, followed by a horrific grinding noise, and then the vehicle shuddered to a dead, heavy halt. Thick black smoke poured from the hood, instantly freezing and falling to the ice like black snow. I checked the GPS coordinates on the dashboard. We were exactly 20 miles from the secondary bunker. 20 miles. In a car on a sunny day, that's a 20-minute drive. On foot, in the Arctic, in the middle of winter, it was an insurmountable death sentence. We had absolutely no choice. We had to abandon the vehicle. We had to go on foot. Moving through an Arctic whiteout is an experience that defies human comprehension. It is like trying to walk inside a massive swirling cloud of crushed glass and razor blades. The wind howls with a deafening physical force, screaming in your ears so loudly that you can't hear yourself think, let alone hear the person screaming right next to you. The blowing snow completely obliterates the horizon, the sky, and the ground, creating a disorienting, featureless void where up and down cease to have meaning. You can't see your own gloved hand if you hold it 3 inches in front of your face. We moved in a single, desperate line, 15 terrified souls physically tethered together by a thick nylon climbing rope tied tightly around our waists. If one person fell and the rope broke, they would be lost to the whiteout in seconds, completely unrecoverable. I took the point position, leaning heavily into the punishing wind, my head down. I had my tactical thermal goggles pulled down over my eyes, the green and orange digital display fighting to cut through the dense blizzard, frantically scanning the blinding void for the bright, blooming heat signatures of the infected that absolutely shouldn't be out there. But they were. They found us when we were agonizingly close. We were just 5 miles from the objective coordinates. I couldn't hear them coming. The roaring wind was far too loud, drowning out their rattling moans and the crunch of their boots. But I felt them. I felt the deep, rhythmic vibration of their heavy footsteps echoing through the solid ice beneath my boots. I stopped, raising my hand to halt the line behind me, and adjusted the gain on my thermal optics. Through the swirling, chaotic snow, the thermal display suddenly lit up like a nightmare. A massive, sprawling horde of them, hundreds of individual heat signatures, preserved by the extreme cold and driven by an insatiable, mindless hunger, was moving toward us. They were moving like a dark, relentless stain spreading rapidly across the pure white world, completely unbothered by the hurricane-force winds that were currently trying to tear us off the face of the earth. They didn't feel the paralyzing cold. They didn't feel the wind shear. They only felt the overwhelming burning desire to consume. I turned back to the line of survivors. I grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, pulling him close so he could hear me over the screaming wind. "Run!" I roared, my voice tearing at my frozen throat. "Follow the GPS compass. Do not stop for anything. Do not look back. I will buy you time." I unclipped the nylon tether from my waist, severing my connection to the group. I watched them hesitate for a fraction of a second before raw survival instinct took over, and they turned and plunged deeper into the whiteout, disappearing from my sight almost instantly. I stayed back, planting my boots firmly on the slick ice, turning to face the oncoming tide of the dead. I dropped my heavy pack to the snow and opened the main pouch. I pulled out the last 3 M67 fragmentation grenades we had managed to scavenge from the armory. They were heavy, cold, and deadly. I drew my AR-15, resting the barrel on my forearm, and watched through the thermal optics as the first chaotic line of the infected crested the slight ridge in front of me. Their faces were terrifyingly blank, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, their hands reaching out blindly through the blizzard. I didn't wait for them to close the distance. I pulled the metal pin on the first grenade, the spoon flying off with a sharp ping. I counted to 3 in my head, feeling the lethal fuse burning down inside the steel shell, and hurled it as far into the center of the mass as my frozen arm could manage. I pulled the pins on the second and third, throwing them in rapid succession in a wide arc to cover their advance. I dropped to the ice, covering the back of my neck with my heavily gloved hands, and opened my mouth to equalize the pressure. The explosions were strangely muffled by the incredibly dense, blowing snow, sounding more like deep subterranean thuds than sharp cracks, but the visual effect was absolutely brilliant. For a few terrifying, beautiful seconds, the entire white world was violently illuminated in a blinding flash of searing orange and yellow fire. The intense heat washed over me, a brief, agonizing reminder of the desert sun. I looked up just in time to see the devastating shockwave tear through the horde. The concussive force and the razor-sharp shrapnel shredded the frozen bodies. I saw limbs, torsos, and shattered heads thrown high into the air, spinning wildly like broken rag dolls into the dark, swirling snow. The blast created a massive smoking crater in the ice, momentarily breaking the horde's advance, throwing them into a chaotic, stumbling pile of severed limbs and burning flesh. It was enough. It was all the time I could buy. I scrambled to my feet, my legs burning with lactic acid, grabbed my rifle, turned, and sprinted into the whiteout after the survivors. I ran until the freezing air violently burned my lungs, until every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, until I could acutely taste the hot, metallic tang of my own blood pooling in the back of my throat. I ran until my legs were completely numb, driven entirely by the primal, desperate refusal to die in the snow. We reached the precise coordinates of the secondary bunker on day 100. It didn't look like much from the outside, just a massive, brutalist concrete monolith set deeply into the sheer, unforgiving side of a jagged mountain, half buried under tons of drifted snow. But to us, it was the gates of heaven. I stumbled to the heavy steel keypad beside the massive blast doors, my fingers so numb and frostbitten they felt like useless blocks of wood. I punched in the emergency access code I had memorized from the director's logs. For a terrifying, agonizing 10 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then, a loud, mechanical klaxon echoed off the mountain, and the massive hydraulic gears engaged. The incredibly thick steel blast doors groaned violently, the ice that had sealed them over the months shattering and falling away in massive chunks, and they slowly began to grind open. We didn't walk inside. We collapsed, falling over the threshold onto the hard, grated metal floor of the airlock, weeping openly. The interior of the bunker was a revelation. It was gloriously, unbelievably warm. The geothermal systems were running perfectly. The bright overhead LED lights were on, casting a clean, sterile glow over the concrete walls. But the most beautiful thing, the thing that made my chest heave with a sob I couldn't control, was the sound coming from the communications room down the hall. For the first time in exactly 100 agonizing days, the long-range radio wasn't just broadcasting the cold, uncaring static of a dead world. A voice, a real human voice, was crackling clearly through the large speakers. To any surviving military or civilian units receiving this broadcast, the voice said, the tone exhausted but undeniably firm. This is the High Arctic Command, broadcasting on all secure frequencies. We are holding the line. We have established a heavily fortified secure quarantine zone in the Yukon Territory. We have power, we have food, and we have walls that will not fall. If you can hear this message, if you are still breathing, head to coordinates 64.06 north, 139.43 west. I repeat, there is a safe zone. You are not alone. Keep moving. I slowly slid down the rough concrete wall, sitting heavily on the warm floor, my back pressed firmly against the solid steel of the interior door. I reached up with a trembling hand, unclasped my tactical helmet, and pulled out the worn, creased photograph of Joy. I stared at her bright, missing tooth smile. I was 3,000 miles away from my home. I was sitting at the bottom of the world, in a universe that had violently, completely ended, surrounded by an ocean of ice and the walking dead. But as I looked at her face, feeling the warmth of the bunker seeping into my frozen bones, I realized something profound. I was still breathing. My heart was still beating. I was still fighting. The world as we knew it ended on the morning of October 15th, 2024. Most of the human population spent that day dying in terror, screaming in the streets as the infection tore through the cities. We spent the last 100 days in the frozen hell of the Arctic, slowly realizing that true survival isn't just about hoarding MREs, counting your bullets, or building thicker concrete walls. It's about the relentless, stubborn refusal to let the silence and the cold win. It's about waking up every single day in a nightmare and deciding to take one more step. My name is Elias Thorne. I am a survivor of Boreas Station. And I am still walking. If you're listening to this broadcast, wherever you are, hiding in a basement, barricaded in a high-rise, or freezing in the woods, know this: you've made it another day. You have already done the impossible. Stay sharp, check your corners, conserve every single round of your ammo, trust your instincts, and whatever you do, no matter how tired you get, no matter how loud the scratching at the door becomes, never, ever stop moving. We will talk again soon. Safe travels, survivors. Keep the fire burning.